to understand just how violent the 20th century really was, you don't need to read an entire history library. You just have to follow the life of a single gun. It was born to be a trench broom in the mud of Europe, but then it turned up in the hands of striking workers in America, Chicago gangsters, paratroopers in Normandy, soldiers in Korea, Vietnam, and in the shadowy wars that followed. The same piece of metal passing through the hands of the state corporations and organized crime. This video isn't just about specs. It's about how all three of those powers shared the same killing tool. And that's exactly where the dark truth of the Thompson begins to show itself. In the First World War, the standard weapon for most armies was still the manually operated rifle, with a 5-round internal magazine firing large, powerful cartridges and offering excellent accuracy at long range. On the parade ground, it was the pride of every army. But in the hell of the trenches, that very rifle exposed all of its limits. In those narrow, muddy trench lines choked with barbed wire and with visibility measured in meters, the soldier was no longer fighting with carefully aimed volleys from a distance, but with whatever he could bring to bear at arm's length. Shovels, daggers, clubs, bayonets, things that felt like relics from another century, were often more useful than a long, unwieldy rifle that only held 5 rounds. The reality of the battlefield was colder than anything written in a training manual. What the soldier needed was something completely different, lighter, handier, faster to reload, and most importantly, capable of pouring out a thick wall of fire in just a few short seconds. The Americans chose the trench shotgun, controversial but absolutely vicious at close range. The Germans went a step further and issued their stormtrooper units the MP-18, one of the first true submachine guns firing 9mm pistol rounds. By the end of the war, the U.S. Army was forced to think about developing a similar weapon of its own, the kind of gun the world would later simply call a submachine gun. John Taliaferro Thompson, a U.S. Army officer and small arms specialist, began to imagine a new kind of trench broom. Instead of buckshot, it would sweep the enemy away with automatic fire. At first he chose the Bliss locking system, but gradually simplified it into a straight blowback mechanism. The earliest prototypes were tested with 30 Nazro 6 ammunition, but that cartridge was far too powerful for the new system. The US military had no true intermediate cartridge between handgun and rifle rounds, so they switched to testing with the 45 ACP pistol cartridge. On paper, this weaker 45 round turned out to be ideal, powerful enough to cycle the action, yet mild enough to allow a simple, easily controlled design compared to gas-operated systems. The recoil from each shot drove the heavy bolt backward, feeding a fresh round and preparing the next shot without any complicated gas-tapping mechanism. Like most machine guns of the era, it fired from an open bolt. From that work, the Annihilator prototype was born. Thompson believed this new weapon could break the bloody deadlock of trench warfare. But by the time it was ready to enter the game, the guns of the First World War had already fallen silent. When the war ended, the U.S. Army all but turned its back, leaving Thompson and the Auto Ordnance Company stranded without a single military order. With no hope of tapping government funds, they were forced to turn toward the civilian market. To do that, the name Annihilator, far too menacing, was quietly put away and replaced with something that sounded more acceptable: the Thompson submachine gun. The first production model, the M1921, is the gun most people recognize from old black and white movies: a charging handle on top of the receiver, a thick wooden stock, and that very distinctive forward pistol grip. It had an extremely high rate of fire, over 900 rounds per minute, and could use both 20-round box magazines and 50-round drum magazines. This was a machine of steel in every sense. Unloaded, it already weighed more than 10 pounds, roughly half a kilo heavier than an AK-47. With a loaded 50-round 45 ACP drum, the weight went up noticeably, but that extra mass helped tame the recoil. Auto Ordnance partnered with Colt to expand production while keeping quality as high as possible, and the price for that was staggering cost. In the 1920s, a single Thompson cost about $200, equivalent to around $4,000 today. In other words, this was a genuinely luxury weapon. In that peculiar moment of American history, a bizarre paradox existed. You could legally buy a submachine gun, but you couldn't legally buy a drink because Prohibition was in effect. The social value system was flipped upside down in a very 1920s sort of way. The Thompsons' earliest customers weren't gangsters at all, but law enforcement, though in small numbers. Soon after, the U.S. Post Office ordered around 200 guns to arm security forces guarding mail trains that were frequently ambushed. Bit by bit, the Thompson crept into American life as a tool of protection for property and public order. Over time, the gun was fine-tuned, a compensator was added, stronger springs were installed, and the bolt mass was adjusted to bring that frantic rate of fire down a little. And then the Thompson finally saw its first real battle, not in Europe, but at the Battle of Blair Mountain in 1921, the largest armed labor uprising in American history. Around 10,000 armed coal miners faced about 3,000 police and hired strikebreakers with roughly 100 Thompsons in the hands of the forces sent to crush the revolt. Even so, its loudest fame came from Hollywood. The film locked Thompson into the public imagination as the signature weapon of gangsters. On February 14, 1929, the St. Valentine's Day massacre pushed that image to a new level. 4 men, 2 of them dressed as policemen, walked into a garage on North Clark Street in Chicago, inside the territory of the Bugs Moran gang. The 7 men inside were ordered to line up facing the wall, believing this was just a routine inspection. Seconds later, 2 Thompsons opened up, firing over 70 rounds in just a few moments. The shock of the massacre dominated front pages across America, and from then on, the name Tommy Gun was burned into the public memory as a symbol of organized crime. In reality, gangsters did use Thompsons in some operations, but that classic image, long trench coats sweeping the street with a Tommy gun, was mostly a Hollywood creation. In real life, the Thompson was so expensive that even criminals had to think twice, and usually preferred cheaper, easier to obtain weapons like sawed-off shotguns or common handguns. Still, a handful of spectacular shootings involving Thompsons was enough to push the US government to clamp down imposing heavy taxes on fully automatic weapons and gradually moving them out of civilian reach. As a result, the Thompson never really sold well on the civilian market. At first, the price was simply too high, and later, the legal barriers became too tight. Before the Second World War broke out, total production was only about 15,000 guns. It was only when war returned that the Thompson truly entered its era. Alongside the original pattern, simplified M1 M1A1 variants appeared with basic fixed sights, a side-mounted charging handle, and 20 or 30 round box magazines. The 50-round drum, which the British complained about, was complicated to load, heavy to carry, and rattled loudly when moving. Because of that, the straight 20 and 30-round stick magazines became the primary choice. The 20-rounder emptied far too quickly given the high rate of fire, so the 30-round magazine almost inevitably became the standard. Britain initially ordered hundreds of thousands of Thompsons for its army, but quickly realized the costs were unsustainable and switched to a much cruder, far cheaper design, the Sten. Over the course of the war, about 1.5 million Thompsons rolled off the production lines and into history. Compared to roughly 6 million M1 Garands and 6 million M1 carbines produced during the war, the Thompson was actually far rarer than its cinematic image suggests. It was never a weapon that everybody slung over their shoulder. It was mostly issued to those in special roles, not to ordinary frontline infantry. Typically, you had to be at least a sergeant to have a good chance of getting a Thompson. Paratroopers, tank crews, commandos, rangers, the units that needed fast, close-range assault capability, were the ones most closely tied to this gun. Those who carried the Thompson often spoke of it with real affection. It was solidly built, mechanically reliable, and viciously effective in urban environments or close-quarters combat. But that strength came with a price. It was simply too heavy for a submachine gun, and US military leadership was not happy about the cost and production time per weapon. On paper, the Thompson was rated effective out to 150 yards, but combat experience suggested a much more realistic range of around 50 yards. The .45 ACP round had excellent stopping power at close range, but struggled to punch through foliage and undergrowth, making it less suitable for jungle warfare. On Iwo Jima, even though Marines loved the Thompson, they eventually shifted toward the bar for fighting in the island's rugged terrain. By this point, the submachine gun concept had spread across all the major powers in the war. Germany had the MP40 firing 9mm ammunition with a lower rate of fire that made it easier to control, slightly more usable at longer ranges, and with a folding stock very convenient for paratroopers and tank crews. Britain had the Sten also in 9mm with its awkward side-mounted magazine that made aiming and reloading uncomfortable. In return, the Sten was cheap and incredibly fast to manufacture using industrial methods, though its reputation for reliability was always a subject of debate. The Soviet Union fielded the PPSH-41 chambered in 7.62 25mm Tokarev, a notably high-velocity pistol cartridge. Combined with a rate of fire over 900 rounds per minute and a 71-round drum, It became one of the most fearsome submachine guns of the war in terms of sheer volume of fire. The cartridge used in the Thompson, by contrast, was much heavier than the 9mm rounds feeding the MP40 and Sten. That meant a US soldier either carried fewer rounds or had to accept a much heavier load. A fully loaded 30-round Thompson magazine weighed about 650 grams, while a 32-round MP40 magazine weighed only around 400 grams, a difference of over 50%. In return, compared to those other designs, the Thompson was almost at the top in terms of workmanship. It was extremely durable and very reliable, but that also made it too expensive and too complex for the kind of mass production total war demanded. Sooner or later, the US Army had to look for another solution. Seeing that the British were making do with cheap Stens, the Americans decided to develop a more budget gun to replace the Thompson. The result was the M3 grease gun, crude, cheap, and simple, but quick to manufacture and perfectly suited to the spirit of industrialized warfare. The Thompson was made from high-quality steel, with each receiver milled and machined from a solid block, a true piece of industrial-age craftsmanship. The M3, by contrast, was made from stamped sheet steel welded together in simple shapes at a fraction of the cost, but with clearly lower fit finish and durability. One was a finely crafted mechanical object, the other a stripped-down tool for the era of mass production war. Yet the story of the Thompson doesn't end with the Second World War. It kept showing up for decades in the Korean War and Vietnam, and in the hands of forces on both sides. The Soviet Union itself received Thompsons via the Lend-Lease program. Even today, the gun can still be spotted in conflict hotspots, including in Ukraine. Outside the battlefield, Thompson moved onto the silver screen. It became a familiar sight in war films and gangster movies, and eventually turned into a highly sought-after collector's item. And like a symbol that refuses to retire, semi-automatic civilian versions of the Thompson are still being produced to this day.